Under the warm glow of the late afternoon sun, a lively scene unfolded in the heart of Lincoln Square. Dozens of families, friends, and passers-by gathered at the community plaza, enjoying the weekend's bustle. The sound of laughter and cheerful chatter filled the air, blending with the distant hum of traffic. It was a peaceful day, one of those moments where life seemed simple and worries were momentarily set aside. At the center of the plaza stood Monica Adams, a vibrant young woman in her late 20s with an aura of confidence and warmth. Her long, thick, natural dreadlocks cascaded down her back, a striking part of her identity. Monica wasn't just another face in the crowd, she was a respected local business owner, the proud founder of a barbershop that specialized in natural hair care for the Black community. Today, she had organized a charity event where she and her team were offering free haircuts to kids from low-income families. For Monica, this wasn't just an event, it was a way to give back to her community, to create something positive in a world that so often tried to push people like her down. The makeshift setup consisted of several folding chairs, mirrors mounted on portable stands, and tables stocked with hair products. Children waited excitedly for their turn, while their parents stood nearby, chatting with one another and occasionally snapping photos of their kids getting their hair cut. It was a wholesome, joyful atmosphere, the kind of gathering that reminded everyone present of the strength and unity within their community. Monica was in her element. With a pair of professional scissors in one hand and a comb in the other, she worked skillfully, shaping a young boy's hair with precision and care. She smiled as the boy giggled, his mother watching nearby with a look of gratitude. "Looking sharp," little man, Monica said warmly, stepping back to admire her work before giving the boy a playful wink. Moments like these made all the hard work worth it. However, not everyone viewed this cheerful scene with the same positivity. Across the street, Officer Rick Barnes sat in his patrol car, his eyes narrowing as he observed the gathering. Barnes was in his mid-30s, a man hardened by years on the force and burdened by personal frustrations he refused to confront. His career had stagnated, his personal life was in shambles, and deep down, he carried a simmering resentment toward those he perceived as different. Though he would never admit it openly, his bias had shaped the way he viewed the world and people like Monica. Barnes's fingers drummed against the steering wheel as he watched the event. To him, the lively gathering didn't look like a peaceful community event. Instead, it triggered something deeper, an irrational suspicion fueled by prejudice. The sight of a Black woman confidently leading a group in a public space gnawed at him. He didn't see charity or kindness, he saw disorder, potential trouble, something that needed to be controlled. He had been patrolling the area for weeks, often without incident. But today, something about Monica's presence irritated him more than usual. Perhaps it was her unapologetic demeanor, her effortless ability to command attention without trying. Perhaps it was the way people seemed to look up to her, respect her. Whatever it was, it fed into his deep-seated need to assert dominance, to remind people of his authority. Barnes grabbed his radio, speaking into it with a tone that carried more urgency than the situation warranted. "Unit 47, I'm at Lincoln Square. There's a large gathering happening at the plaza. No permits visible. Possible unauthorized event. Requesting backup." The dispatcher's response crackled through the speaker. "Copy that, Unit 47. Do you require immediate assistance?" Barnes hesitated for a moment, glancing once more at the crowd. He could handle this on his own, or so he thought. "Negative. I'll check it out solo." He exited his vehicle, adjusting his belt as he made his way across the street toward the plaza. The cheerful sounds of the event grew louder with each step, contrasting sharply with the tension building within him. As he approached, several people noticed him. their conversations trailing off as they exchanged uncertain glances. They had seen officers around before, but this time felt different. Barnes's demeanor was rigid, his expression stern, and his presence exuded an unspoken hostility. Monica was finishing up another haircut when she noticed the shift in the crowd's energy. She turned, her eyes landing on Barnes as he approached. She could tell immediately that he wasn't here to enjoy the event or show support. His posture, his gaze, everything about him screamed confrontation. She sighed inwardly, already bracing herself for what she suspected was coming. "Afternoon, Officer," Monica said politely, her voice calm but firm. She set down her scissors, wiping her hands on a towel as she stepped forward to meet him. "Can I help you with something?" Barnes didn't return her greeting. Instead, his eyes scanned the setup, lingering on the chairs, tables, and hair products. He noted the absence of any obvious permits or official documentation, though he hadn't actually bothered to ask whether one was required. To him, this was enough justification to intervene. "What's going on here?" Barnes asked brusquely, his tone carrying an accusatory edge. Monica remained composed, refusing to let his demeanor unsettle her. "It's a charity event. Free haircuts for kids. We've been doing this every month with the support of the community." "Where's your permit?" Barnes demanded, cutting her off before she could say more. His hand rested on his utility belt, a subtle but deliberate gesture meant to assert his authority. Monica's brow furrowed slightly. "We've coordinated with the local council. They've never asked us for a permit before." Barnes's expression hardened. He wasn't interested in explanations. "You're blocking public space and operating without proper authorization. That's a violation." Several parents nearby began murmuring among themselves, sensing the tension rising. A few of them moved closer, instinctively placing themselves between their children and the officer. The atmosphere, once filled with laughter and joy, now felt heavy, charged with unease. Monica took a step closer to Barnes, her voice steady but laced with resolve. "Officer, we're not causing any harm. This is a peaceful event. If you'd like to speak with someone from the council, I can give you their contact information." Barnes ignored her offer, his eyes narrowing as he spotted the scissors she had set down on the table. He seized on them as an opportunity to escalate the situation further. "Those scissors, potential weapon. I need you to hand them over." Monica blinked, momentarily caught off guard by the absurdity of the request. "Excuse me? They're haircutting scissors. We're giving haircuts, not posing a threat." Barnes took a step closer, his voice lowering but gaining a menacing edge. "I said, hand them over." For a brief moment, the two stood in tense silence, their eyes locked. Monica could feel the weight of the crowd's gaze on her, could sense the fear and uncertainty spreading among them. She knew that any sudden move on her part could be misinterpreted, could give Barnes the excuse he was looking for. But she also knew that backing down would mean conceding to an abuse of power, something she had spent her whole life fighting against. Without breaking eye contact, Monica slowly picked up the scissors and held them out to Barnes. "Here. But you should know this is harassment. We're not doing anything wrong." Barnes snatched the scissors from her hand, his grip tightening around them, as though he had just confiscated a dangerous weapon. He glanced around at the crowd, many of whom were now recording the encounter on their phones. His jaw tightened, a flicker of irritation crossing his features. Monica could see the momentary uncertainty in his eyes, the realization that he might have miscalculated. But instead of de-escalating, Barnes doubled down. "I'm going to need you to shut this down immediately," he said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Monica clenched her jaw, feeling a surge of anger rising within her. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, a familiar voice called out from behind the crowd. "Is there a problem here, officer?" Monica turned her head toward the source of the voice, immediately recognizing the tall figure making his way through the crowd. It was her cousin, Jordan Adams, a well-known civil rights lawyer in the community. His presence seemed to ease some of the tension among the onlookers, many of whom knew him from his numerous appearances in court defending victims of police misconduct. Jordan was sharp, confident, and, most importantly, unshakable when it came to situations like this. He didn't just know the law, he lived and breathed it, using it as both shield and sword in his relentless pursuit of justice. Dressed in a tailored suit that made him stand out among the casually dressed crowd, Jordan's expression was calm but serious. He had clearly assessed the situation the moment he arrived, noting the rigid stance of Officer Barnes, the uncomfortable murmurs of the gathered parents, and most disturbingly the way Monica was standing with her arms slightly raised, as if trying to avoid any move that could be perceived as threatening. Barnes shifted his posture slightly, clearly taken aback by Jordan's unexpected entrance. He hadn't anticipated anyone with authority or the appearance of authority to intervene so quickly. His eyes flicked to the crowd, realizing that their attention had now fully turned toward this new player in the unfolding drama. "Who are you?" Barnes asked curtly, his tone laced with irritation. "I'm Jordan Adams," he said smoothly, stepping closer to stand beside Monica. His voice was measured, controlled, but there was an undercurrent of steel in his words. "I'm her legal representative, and I'd like to know exactly what grounds you have for detaining my cousin and attempting to shut down a legally sanctioned community event." Barnes bristled at the word detaining. He hadn't officially used that term, but he knew that in practice, his actions already bordered on an unlawful detention. The last thing he needed was a lawyer throwing around legal jargon in front of a crowd that was clearly growing more restless by the minute. Still, his pride wouldn't let him back down. "This isn't about detention," Barnes said sharply. "It's about public safety. This gathering is unauthorized, and she's carrying sharp objects in a public space, which could pose a threat." Jordan raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting into one of mild disbelief. "Sharp objects? You mean the scissors she's using to give haircuts to children? Come on, officer, let's not insult everyone's intelligence here." He gestured toward the chairs and tables where several kids were still waiting their turn, now sitting quietly as they watched the scene unfold with wide eyes. Barnes's grip on the scissors tightened, his knuckles whitening as he felt control slipping away. "Look, this isn't a debate. I've asked her to shut it down, and I expect compliance." "Compliance," Jordan echoed, his tone cooling further. "Officer, let's be clear. You've shown up here without cause, you've harassed a peaceful organizer, and you've seized her property without a warrant. If anyone is out of line here, it's not my cousin, it's you." Monica felt a flicker of gratitude toward Jordan, but she remained tense. She knew that things could still escalate at any moment, and while she trusted her cousin's ability to handle the situation, she also knew how unpredictable officers like Barnes could be when they felt cornered. Barnes's eyes darted around, looking for some kind of support. He spotted his backup unit, a pair of officers standing near the edge of the crowd, observing the situation but not yet stepping in. He gave them a brief nod, signaling them to approach. Jordan noticed the subtle gesture and stepped in front of Monica, placing himself squarely between her and Barnes. "If you're calling for backup, officer, I'd advise you to reconsider. This is already turning into a legal nightmare for you, and adding more officers to the mix will only make things worse." Barnes ignored the warning, his frustration boiling over. "You think you can just waltz in here and start giving orders? I don't care who you are. This is my jurisdiction, and I'll handle it how I see fit." Jordan didn't flinch. Instead, he folded his arms across his chest, projecting calm authority. "No, officer, you'll handle it according to the law. And right now you're dangerously close to violating multiple statutes. Unlawful detention, harassment, abuse of power, I could go on. Do you really want to take this any further?" The two officers Barnes had signaled earlier finally reached the scene. One of them, a younger officer with a nervous expression, seemed hesitant to intervene. The other, older and more experienced, gave Barnes a questioning look. It was clear he wasn't entirely comfortable with how things were unfolding. "Everything okay here?" Rick, the older officer, asked, his tone cautious. "Just dealing with a bit of non-compliance," Barnes replied tightly, his eyes never leaving Jordan's. Jordan smiled thinly. Non-compliance is a strong word for someone exercising their constitutional right to hold a peaceful gathering. But sure, let's call it that. Why don't you tell your colleagues here exactly what the alleged infraction is, and we'll see if they agree. The older officer frowned slightly, glancing at the setup around them. It didn't take a legal expert to see that this was no criminal enterprise, just a group of people trying to do something good for their community. He shifted uncomfortably, clearly weighing his options. "Look, Rick," he said quietly, stepping closer to Barnes, "maybe we should de-escalate. This doesn't look like something we need to get involved in." Barnes clenched his jaw, feeling the sting of his colleague's implied criticism. He had come here intending to assert control, but now he was rapidly losing face in front of the crowd and worse, in front of Jordan, who seemed to revel in dismantling his authority piece by piece. "I'm not backing down," Barnes muttered. "They're obstructing public space without a permit." The older officer sighed, clearly realizing that Barnes wasn't going to let this go. He turned to Jordan. "Maybe we can work something out here. If they have a permit or any kind of approval from the council, we can let this slide." "We've already coordinated with the council," Monica said, finally finding her voice again. "They're fully aware of this event. We've been doing it every month for nearly a year without any issues." Jordan nodded in agreement. "If you'd like, officer, I can call the council representative right now and have them confirm it." Barnes knew he was cornered. If the council confirmed Monica's claim, it would be clear that his actions were unjustified. But admitting defeat in front of everyone was something his pride wouldn't allow. "Fine," he snapped, shoving the scissors back into Monica's hands. "Keep your little event. But next time, make sure you have everything in writing." With that, he turned sharply and began walking away, the tension in his posture evident to anyone watching. The older officer gave Jordan and Monica an apologetic nod before following Barnes, while the younger officer hesitated briefly before doing the same. As soon as they were out of earshot, the crowd let out a collective breath, the tension finally easing. Several people approached Monica, offering words of support and gratitude. She smiled weakly, grateful for their kindness, but still shaken by what had just happened. Jordan placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "You okay?" "I will be," Monica said quietly. "Thanks for stepping in." "Always," Jordan replied with a small smile. "But this isn't over. Barnes isn't the type to let things go easily. We need to be prepared for whatever he tries next." Monica nodded, knowing he was right. For now, though, they had won this round. But the battle for justice was far from over. Monica was still reeling from the encounter when she noticed something unsettling. Although Barnes and his backup officers had walked away from the immediate scene, Barnes hadn't gone far. He stood by his patrol car across the street, speaking into his radio with an expression that suggested he wasn't finished with them yet. Jordan, standing beside her, noticed it too. His eyes narrowed as he watched Barnes gesturing angrily, occasionally glancing back in their direction as if plotting his next move. It was clear that Barnes wasn't one to simply let things go, especially not when his authority had been publicly challenged. The tension lingered in the air, thick and palpable. Monica knew from experience that moments like these rarely ended cleanly. Sure enough, within minutes, another police vehicle pulled up, followed by 2 more. A total of 6 officers were now present, and all of them seemed to be taking their cues from Barnes. The crowd, sensing the renewed tension, began to murmur anxiously. Parents instinctively drew their children closer, unsure of what might happen next. The previously joyful atmosphere of the event had been completely replaced by an air of unease and fear. Jordan stepped forward, placing himself slightly in front of Monica, as if shielding her from whatever was about to come. He wasn't intimidated by the growing police presence. He had dealt with worse, but he knew that any misstep could lead to disaster. Barnes wasn't just angry, he was humiliated, and humiliated men in positions of power often acted rashly. "Stay calm," Jordan said quietly to Monica. "Don't give him any excuse to escalate." "I'm calm," Monica replied, though her voice betrayed a hint of tension. "But he's not. Look at him. He's just waiting for a reason." Before Jordan could respond, Barnes began walking back toward them, flanked by 2 of the newly arrived officers. His expression was cold, calculated, and utterly devoid of the pretense of professionalism he had initially tried to maintain. He wasn't here to de-escalate, he was here to reassert his dominance, to send a message that no one could challenge his authority without consequences. "All right, enough of this," Barnes said loudly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. "This event is over. Everyone needs to disperse immediately." Several people in the crowd began to protest, their voices rising in indignation. "Why? We're not doing anything wrong," one woman shouted. "We've been here for hours without any problems until you showed up." "This is a peaceful event," another man added. "We're not breaking any laws." Barnes ignored the protests, his eyes fixed solely on Monica and Jordan. "You two," he said, pointing at them. "You're obstructing a public space without proper authorization. If you don't pack up and leave right now, I'll have no choice but to place you under arrest." Jordan's jaw tightened, but he remained composed. "Officer, we've already explained that this event is sanctioned by the local council. If you need further confirmation, I can call the council representative right now." "I don't need you to call anyone," Barnes snapped. "I'm giving you a lawful order. Either you comply, or you face the consequences." Monica felt her heart rate quicken. She knew how quickly things could spiral out of control in situations like this, but she also knew that backing down now would set a dangerous precedent. If they allowed Barnes to shut them down without cause, it would send a message that their community could be intimidated and silenced at will. "We're not leaving," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the anxiety knotting her stomach. "This is our right. We're not breaking any laws." Barnes's expression darkened, and for a moment, it looked as though he might lash out. Instead, he turned to the officers flanking him and muttered something under his breath. One of them nodded and began approaching the makeshift setup where Monica and her team had been working. "What are you doing?" Jordan demanded, stepping forward to block the officer's path. The officer hesitated, glancing back at Barnes for guidance. Barnes gave a curt nod, signaling him to proceed. "We're confiscating any unauthorized equipment," Barnes said smugly. "Since you don't have a permit, all of this is subject to impoundment." "That's illegal, and you know it," Jordan said sharply. "You can't just confiscate private property without cause or a warrant." Barnes's smirk widened. "Watch me." The officer reached for one of the chairs, but before he could grab it, Monica stepped in front of him. "Don't touch our things," she said, her voice low but resolute. "We worked hard to organize this for the kids. You have no right." "Step aside." "Ma," the officer said, clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to defy Barnes's orders. "No," Monica said, standing her ground. Barnes took a step closer, his hand resting on the handle of his baton. The crowd tensed, sensing that things were about to escalate further. Several people pulled out their phones, not to provoke but to document what was happening. They knew that situations like these could quickly turn ugly, and they wanted to make sure there was a record of it. "Last chance," Barnes said coldly. "Step aside, or you'll be arrested for obstructing an officer." Monica didn't move. She refused to be intimidated, even as fear churned in her gut. This was her community, her event, and she wouldn't let Barnes bully her into submission. "I'm not obstructing anything," she said. "I'm standing up for what's right." Barnes's patience snapped. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Monica by the arm, yanking her away from the setup with enough force to make her stumble. A collective gasp went up from the crowd as Monica struggled to regain her balance. "Hey," Jordan shouted, stepping forward. "Let go of her." Barnes ignored him, pulling a pair of handcuffs from his belt. "You're under arrest for obstruction and resisting a lawful order." "I wasn't resisting," Monica protested, her voice rising in anger and disbelief. "Stop," Jordan said, his voice laced with authority. "You're crossing a line, officer. Let her go now, or you'll be facing a lawsuit so big your department won't know what hit them." Barnes hesitated for a fraction of a second, clearly weighing his options. He knew that arresting Monica could lead to serious legal trouble, but his pride wouldn't allow him to back down completely. Instead, he tightened his grip on her arm and turned to the officers behind him. "Cuff her," he ordered. One of the officers stepped forward reluctantly, clearly uneasy with the situation. Before he could comply, Jordan moved quickly, placing himself between Monica and the approaching officer. "This has gone far enough," Jordan said, his voice dangerously calm. "If you lay another hand on her, I will personally ensure that you're held accountable for unlawful detention, assault, and abuse of power. And trust me, Officer Barnes, you do not want to test me on this." Barnes glared at Jordan, his chest heaving with barely contained rage. He was trapped, and he knew it. If he backed down now, he would look weak in front of the crowd and his fellow officers. But if he continued, he risked serious legal repercussions. The tension hung in the air like a live wire, crackling with the potential for violence. For a moment, it seemed as though Barnes might push forward regardless of the consequences. But then, with a muttered curse, he released Monica's arm and took a step back. "This isn't over," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You think you've won, but you haven't. I'll be watching." Jordan didn't respond. He simply stood his ground, watching Barnes retreat with narrowed eyes. The crowd began to disperse slowly, the sense of immediate danger fading but not entirely gone. Monica rubbed her arm where Barnes had grabbed her, feeling a mix of relief and lingering fear. She knew this wasn't the end of it. Barnes was the type of man who held grudges, and he wouldn't let this go easily. "Are you okay?" Jordan asked, his voice gentle now. "I'm fine," Monica said, though her voice wavered slightly. "Thank you for stepping in." "Always," Jordan said. "But we need to be ready. He'll be back, and next time, he won't be alone." The tension that had seemed to dissipate moments ago lingered in Monica's mind long after Officer Barnes walked away. Though the crowd was beginning to relax, and the children resumed their playful chatter, Monica knew that this wasn't over. Barnes had made that abundantly clear with his parting words. His pride had been wounded, and men like him didn't let things like that slide. They came back, often harder, more prepared, and with an even deeper need to prove their authority. Jordan remained by her side, his sharp gaze trailing Barnes as he returned to his patrol car. The officers who had accompanied him seemed equally uncomfortable, exchanging glances but saying little. Monica could tell that even they hadn't fully agreed with Barnes's actions. It was often the case there were always those who stood by silently, unwilling to openly challenge misconduct, but not fully supporting it either. That passive complicity was part of what made people like Barnes feel invincible. "You all right?" Jordan asked, his voice low and steady. "I'm okay," Monica replied, though the tightness in her chest said otherwise. "But I know he's not done. He didn't get what he wanted, and guys like that hate losing control." Jordan nodded. "You're right. He'll be looking for a way to get back at you, at us. We have to be ready for whatever comes next." Monica took a deep breath, forcing herself to refocus. She couldn't let fear rule her actions. That was exactly what Barnes wanted, to intimidate her into submission, to make her feel powerless in her own community. But she wasn't going to give him that satisfaction. "I'm not shutting this down," she said firmly. "This event means something to these kids, to their families. We've worked too hard to let one bitter cop ruin it." Jordan gave her a small, approving smile. "Good. But let's be smart about this. We'll keep things going, but we'll also keep our eyes open. If Barnes makes another move, we document everything. No room for error." As if on cue, one of Monica's barbers approached them, concern etched across his face. "Hey, you think it's safe to keep going?" That cop looked like he was ready to snap. Monica met his worried gaze with a calm determination. "We're not doing anything wrong. This is a legal event. If he comes back, we'll handle it, but we're not giving him a reason to shut us down." The barber hesitated, then nodded. "All right, just be careful, okay? People like him, they don't play fair." Monica knew he was right, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She turned back to the group of kids waiting for their haircuts and gave them a reassuring smile. "All right, who's next?" she called out, her voice steady and warm. Slowly, the atmosphere began to shift back to something resembling normalcy. The kids returned to their playful chatter, parents resumed their conversations, and the barbers got back to work. But the underlying tension remained, a quiet reminder that peace was fragile and easily shattered. Jordan, meanwhile, remained vigilant. He knew Barnes well enough to understand that the officer wasn't going to let things end here. Men like Barnes didn't handle public humiliation well, especially when it came at the hands of someone they already harbored prejudice against. Jordan had dealt with plenty of officers like him in court, officers who thought their badge gave them unchecked power, who viewed any challenge to their authority as a personal attack. His phone buzzed in his pocket, pulling him momentarily from his thoughts. He glanced at the screen and saw a message from one of his contacts at City Hall. "Heard about the incident. Need details. Call me when you can." Jordan's contacts in local government were part of what made him such an effective advocate. He had spent years building relationships with people who believed in justice and accountability, people who were willing to stand up to systemic abuse when necessary. If Barnes pushed things further, Jordan knew he would have the backing he needed to escalate the situation legally and politically. But for now, his focus was on keeping Monica and the event safe. He put his phone away and resumed scanning the area, his gaze occasionally flicking back to Barnes's patrol car. Barnes was still there, watching them from a distance, his expression unreadable. It was a waiting game now, and Jordan intended to stay one step ahead. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and still Barnes didn't leave. Monica continued working, her movements precise and practiced as she gave haircuts and engaged with the kids. Despite the tension, she remained a calming presence, her determination shining through in every interaction. She refused to let Barnes's looming presence steal the joy from the day. But just as things seemed to settle, a new development caught Jordan's attention. A black, unmarked car pulled up near Barnes's patrol vehicle, and two men in plain clothes stepped out. Jordan recognized the type immediately: internal affairs, Their presence was both unexpected and significant. Someone, likely one of the concerned onlookers, had reported Barnes's behavior, prompting an immediate response. Jordan watched closely as the two plainclothes officers approached Barnes. They spoke briefly, their expressions serious. Barnes looked increasingly agitated as the conversation continued, his posture growing more rigid with each passing second. It was clear that he didn't appreciate being questioned, especially not in front of the very people he had tried to intimidate. After a few minutes, one of the internal affairs officers gestured toward the plaza, as if indicating that they wanted to speak with someone involved in the event. Barnes's jaw clenched, but he didn't object. He knew he had no choice. The two plainclothes officers began making their way toward Monica and Jordan. The crowd noticed the approach, and a hush fell over the plaza once again. Everyone was watching, waiting to see what would happen next. MS. Adams, one of the officers, said as he reached them. His tone was polite but professional. "I'm Officer Grant, Internal Affairs. We received a report about an incident involving one of our officers. Would you mind answering a few questions?" Monica glanced at Jordan, who gave her a reassuring nod. "Of course," she said, her voice steady despite the tension in the air. Grant nodded in appreciation. "We understand this has been a stressful situation. Our goal is to gather facts and ensure that proper procedures are followed." Monica took a deep breath, then began recounting the events as they had unfolded. She described how Barnes had arrived, his initial demands to shut down the event, and the escalation that followed when she refused to comply without cause. She didn't embellish or exaggerate, she simply told the truth. Jordan listened closely, ready to step in if necessary, but Monica handled herself with composure and clarity. He couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. Despite everything, she hadn't let fear or anger cloud her judgment. She had stood her ground with dignity, and now she was telling her story with the same grace. When Monica finished, Grant nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you for your cooperation, MS. Adams. We'll be conducting a thorough investigation into this matter. In the meantime, you have every right to continue your event as planned." Monica felt a wave of relief, but it was tempered by caution. She knew that investigations like these didn't always lead to justice, especially when the officer in question had friends in high places. Still, it was a step in the right direction. As Grant and his partner walked away, Jordan turned to Monica. "You did great, but don't let your guard down. Barnes isn't going to take this lying down." Monica nodded. "I know, but at least now he knows we're not alone. We have people watching, people who care." Jordan smiled faintly. "Yeah, and we're not done yet. This isn't just about today, it's about making sure people like Barnes don't get away with this kind of behavior ever again." Monica looked out at the crowd, at the kids who had come for haircuts and the parents who had gathered to support them. She knew Jordan was right. This wasn't just about one bad cop or one bad day. It was about something much bigger, a fight for dignity, respect, and justice that wouldn't end with a single event. And she was ready for it. Monica stood quietly as the internal affairs officers walked back toward their vehicle. Though the tension in her shoulders eased slightly, she remained wary. A part of her wanted to believe that the situation was under control now, that Barnes wouldn't dare escalate things further with Iowa already involved. But another part of her, the part that had experienced enough injustice to know how these things often played out, warned her not to relax too soon. Men like Barnes didn't just back down, they doubled down, and they often found ways to turn things in their favor. Jordan shared her unease. He had seen too many cases where officers who were caught in the act of misconduct twisted the narrative to make themselves look like the victims. Barnes, he was sure, would be no different. As if on cue, Barnes's patrol car door swung open, and he stepped out again, this time alone. His expression was different now, not the smug arrogance he'd worn earlier, but something darker, more dangerous. He was clearly agitated, his pride still stinging from being publicly challenged and now questioned by internal affairs. Jordan immediately stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of Monica, not because he thought she needed protection, but because he wanted to make it clear to Barnes that he wasn't going to let this go any further without a fight. Barnes noticed the movement and smirked slightly, as if amused by the lawyer's silent display of defiance. "I see you're still here," Barnes said, his tone dripping with disdain. He spoke loudly enough for the nearby crowd to hear, clearly trying to reassert his authority in the eyes of the public. "Thought you'd be smart enough to pack up and leave by now." "We're still here because we're not doing anything illegal," Jordan replied calmly. "And I think internal affairs made that pretty clear when they told us we could continue." Barnes's eyes flicked toward the Iowa officers, who were now watching the scene unfold from a distance. He knew they were still there, but he also knew that they weren't likely to intervene unless something overt happened. All he had to do was push just hard enough to provoke a reaction from Monica or Jordan, something he could use to justify taking action. "You think you can hide behind Iowa and your fancy lawyer words," Barnes said, taking a step closer. "But out here, on the street, it's people like me who keep things in order. And I don't need a permit to shut down a disturbance when I see one." "There's no disturbance here," Monica said, her voice steady but firm. "The only disturbance has been you, Officer Barnes." The crowd, which had grown quiet as Barnes approached, began murmuring again. People exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that things were about to escalate once more. A few parents began gathering their children, moving them farther away from the confrontation. Though they didn't want to leave, they also didn't want their kids caught in the middle of whatever might happen next. Barnes's jaw clenched, his hands resting on his belt in a way that suggested he was itching for an excuse to use force. Jordan saw the subtle shift in his posture and knew they were walking a fine line. If Barnes felt humiliated again, he might lash out, and that could lead to someone getting hurt or worse. "Officer Barnes." Jordan said carefully, his tone measured. "I suggest you reconsider your approach. We've been compliant, respectful, and cooperative. You, on the other hand, have been aggressive and confrontational without cause. If you continue down this path, it's only going to get worse for you." Barnes let out a bitter laugh. "Is that a threat, Counselor?" "It's a fact," Jordan replied evenly. "You've already crossed several lines today. Internal Affairs is watching. The community is watching. Every move you make from here on out will be scrutinized, and any further misconduct on your part will have serious consequences." Barnes took another step forward, now standing just a few feet away from Jordan. His expression was tense, his eyes cold and calculating. He wasn't used to being challenged like this, and it was clear that he didn't know how to handle it without resorting to force. "You think you can scare me?" Barnes said, his voice low and menacing. "I've dealt with your kind before, big talkers who think the law protects them. But out here, it's different. Out here, it's about who's in control." Jordan didn't flinch. "You're right, officer. It is about control. But control isn't about intimidation or force, it's about restraint, about knowing when to de-escalate instead of escalate. And right now, you're doing the opposite." Barnes's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, it seemed as though he might actually back down. But then, something in him snapped. Without warning, he reached out and grabbed Jordan by the arm, yanking him forward. "That's it," Barnes said harshly. "You're under arrest for obstruction of justice." The crowd erupted in shock, several people pulling out their phones to record the incident. Monica stepped forward instinctively, her heart pounding in her chest. Let him go, she demanded, her voice rising. Barnes ignored her, focusing entirely on Jordan, who remained remarkably calm despite the sudden escalation. "You're making a mistake," Officer Jordan said quietly. "Let go of me now, and we can still resolve this without further incident." But Barnes was beyond reasoning. His grip tightened, and he began pulling Jordan toward his patrol car. The other officers nearby hesitated, clearly unsure of what to do. They could see that Barnes was acting out of anger rather than necessity, but none of them wanted to be the one to openly challenge him. Monica's mind raced. She knew that if Jordan was taken into custody, things would spiral out of control. Barnes would find a way to justify his actions, and by the time they managed to fight it in court, the damage would already be done. Without thinking, she stepped directly in Barnes's path, blocking his way. "You're not taking him," she said firmly. "He hasn't done anything wrong." Barnes stopped, his eyes blazing with fury. "Step aside, or you're next." "No," Monica said, her voice unwavering. "You can't just arrest people because they challenge your authority. That's not how the law works." Barnes's hand twitched toward his baton, and for a terrifying moment, it seemed as though he might actually use it. But before he could act, one of the internal affairs officers approached, his expression stern. "Officer Barnes, stand down," the Iowa officer said firmly. "We've seen enough." Barnes froze, his grip on Jordan's arm loosening slightly. "This isn't your call," he snapped. "It is now," the Iowa officer replied. "You've crossed the line. Let him go, or you'll be facing immediate suspension pending an investigation." For a moment, it seemed as though Barnes might defy the order. His pride was clearly warring with his sense of self-preservation. But eventually he released Jordan's arm with a sneer. "This isn't over," Barnes muttered, stepping back. "You'll regret this." Jordan straightened his suit, brushing off the wrinkles Barnes's grip had left. "No, Officer Barnes. The only one who's going to regret anything here is you." The crowd watched in tense silence as Barnes retreated to his patrol car. The internal affairs officers remained behind, ensuring that he didn't attempt anything further. Slowly, the tension began to ease once more, though the sense of unease lingered. Monica turned to Jordan, her expression a mix of relief and lingering anxiety. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine," Jordan replied, though his voice carried a hint of weariness. "But you were right, he wasn't going to back down without a fight." Monica exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. "What do we do now?" "We keep going," Jordan said. "But we stay vigilant. Barnes isn't done, not by a long shot, but neither are we." The air remained thick with tension even after Barnes retreated to his patrol car. Though it seemed like the immediate danger had passed, Monica couldn't shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more serious. Barnes wasn't a man who accepted defeat easily, and his bruised ego had only been made worse by the intervention of internal affairs. He had been publicly humiliated, and Monica knew that men like him didn't simply walk away. They found ways to retaliate, to reassert their power in more covert but equally damaging ways. Jordan stood beside her, outwardly calm but inwardly running through every possible next move. His years of experience as a civil rights lawyer had taught him that moments like these often mark the beginning, not the end, of a conflict. Barnes might have backed off for now, but this was far from over. They needed to remain vigilant, document everything, and be ready to act swiftly if things escalated again. Monica returned to her makeshift setup, trying to project a sense of normalcy for the kids and parents who were still lingering, unsure whether it was safe to stay or if they should leave. She smiled warmly at a young girl who had been waiting patiently for her turn. "All right, sweetheart. Let's get you looking fabulous," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil swirling inside her. As she worked, Jordan's phone buzzed again. He glanced at the screen and saw another message from his contact at City Hall. Barnes is known for pushing boundaries. Be careful, we're monitoring the situation. Jordan appreciated the support, but he knew that real change wouldn't come from quiet observations. It would require action, and more importantly, it would require people like Monica standing their ground despite the risks. Minutes passed, then half an hour, and though Barnes remained parked nearby, he made no further moves. The internal affairs officers stayed as well, likely as a precaution, ensuring that Barnes didn't do anything rash. The crowd began to relax again, conversations resuming, though there was still an undercurrent of unease. Parents continued to watch closely, their eyes flicking toward Barnes's patrol car every so often. But just when it seemed like things might return to normal, a black SUV pulled up alongside Barnes's vehicle. Two men in plain clothes stepped out, their serious expressions immediately putting everyone on edge. They exchanged a few words with Barnes, who gestured angrily toward the plaza. The men didn't seem fazed by his outburst. Instead, they gave him a curt nod before turning their attention toward the crowd. Jordan recognized the type instantly: plainclothes officers, likely detectives. Their presence didn't bode well. Detectives didn't show up unless there was an official investigation underway, or unless someone had decided to escalate the situation in a more calculated manner. Here we go, Jordan muttered under his breath, stepping closer to Monica. The two detectives approached with measured steps, their eyes scanning the setup as though assessing a crime scene. One of them, a tall man with a stern expression and graying hair, spoke first. "MS." Monica set down her scissors and turned to face him, her expression calm but guarded. "Yes, I'm Detective Langley. This is my partner, Detective Rivers. We're here to follow up on reports of unauthorized activity in a public space and potential public safety concerns." Jordan immediately stepped in. "Detective, we've already been through this. Internal Affairs was here, and they confirmed that this event is sanctioned by the council. There are no public safety issues, and there's no unauthorized activity." Langley didn't seem impressed by Jordan's words. He pulled out a small notepad and flipped it open. "We're aware of the previous interaction. However, new information has come to light that requires further investigation." Monica frowned. "What new information?" Langley didn't answer directly. Instead, he gave her a pointed look. "We've received reports that someone here might be in possession of illegal substances." The accusation hung in the air like a thundercloud, drawing gasps from several people nearby. Monica's heart began to race, not because she had anything to hide, but because she knew exactly what this was a setup. Barnes couldn't shut down the event legally, so now he was trying to fabricate a reason to justify his actions. "That's ridiculous," Jordan said firmly. "You have no probable cause to make such an accusation, and unless you have a warrant, you're not conducting any searches." Langley remained unfazed. "We don't need a warrant if there's reasonable suspicion." "There is no reasonable suspicion," Jordan countered. "This is a public event with dozens of witnesses. You're not intimidating anyone into compliance with baseless accusations." A crowd had begun to gather again, their murmurs growing louder as word spread about the detective's arrival and the nature of their accusation. People were pulling out their phones once more, recording the exchange. The atmosphere, which had briefly calmed, was now tense and charged with anticipation. Monica stepped forward, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "Detective, this is a charity event for children. We've been doing this for months without any problems. The only disturbance today has been caused by Officer Barnes and now you. We have nothing to hide." Langley met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "Then you won't mind if we take a quick look around?" Jordan's hand tightened into a fist at his side. This was exactly the kind of abuse of power he had fought against for years, officers using vague accusations and fabricated suspicions to justify illegal searches and harassment. He knew they had to be careful. If Monica refused outright, it could be spun as non-compliance. But if they allowed the search, it would set a dangerous precedent, not just for them, but for anyone who found themselves in a similar situation. Before he could respond, a voice called out from the edge of the crowd. "What's going on here?" Everyone turned to see a tall man in a suit approaching. He walked with an air of authority, his presence commanding attention. Jordan recognized him immediately. It was Councilman Davis, the local representative who had approved the event in the first place. Langley's expression flickered with something akin to annoyance. "Councilman, we're conducting an investigation into reports of unauthorized activity." Davis raised an eyebrow. "Interesting, because I personally approved this event, and I've been following the situation closely since I received word about Officer Barnes's earlier involvement." Langley opened his mouth to respond, but Davis cut him off. "Detective, unless you have concrete evidence or a warrant, I suggest you reconsider your approach. This community has the right to hold peaceful gatherings without being subjected to harassment." The tension in the air was palpable. Langley glanced toward Barnes, who was watching from a distance, his expression dark. It was clear that Barnes had hoped the detectives would escalate things in his favor, but with the councilman now involved, that plan was rapidly unraveling. After a long moment, Langley closed his notepad and gave a curt nod. "We'll be following up on this matter through official channels." "You do that," Davis said, his tone cool. "In the meantime, I expect you and your officers to respect the rights of my constituents." Without another word, Langley and Rivers turned and walked back toward their SUV. The crowd watched in silence as they drove away, followed shortly by Barnes, who shot one last glare at Monica and Jordan before speeding off. As the vehicles disappeared from sight, a cheer erupted from the crowd. Monica felt a wave of relief wash over her, though she knew this wasn't the end. Barnes would try again, in some other way, on some other day. But for now, they had won. "Thank you," Monica said to Davis, her voice filled with genuine gratitude. He smiled. "No need to thank me. Just keep doing what you're doing. This community needs people like you." As Davis walked away, Jordan turned to Monica, a proud smile on his face. "You handled that perfectly." Monica exhaled slowly. "I couldn't have done it without you or without everyone here standing with us." Jordan nodded. "This isn't just about today. It's about showing them that we won't back down." And as Monica looked out at the faces of the people around her, friends, neighbors, families, she knew that was true. The fight wasn't over, but they had taken a stand, and they weren't alone. They had each other, and together they were stronger than any fear or intimidation Barnes could throw their way. As the crowd gradually dispersed, the tension of the day finally began to ebb, replaced by a quieter, more reflective atmosphere. Monica stood near her makeshift setup, taking a moment to process everything that had happened. The past few hours had been a whirlwind of escalating confrontations, blatant abuse of power, and a hard-fought defense of their right to exist peacefully in a public space. Though they had managed to hold their ground and send Barnes packing, Monica knew this wasn't the end of the story. Men like Barnes didn't just walk away from situations like this. They lingered, waited for the right moment, and tried to strike back when no one was looking. Jordan stood beside her, scrolling through his phone, likely checking for updates from his contacts. He had remained calm throughout the ordeal, but now that things had settled, Monica could see the subtle signs of exhaustion on his face. He had spent years fighting battles like this in courtrooms, on the streets, and through legal proceedings, and today had been no different. Still, there was something about today that felt heavier, more personal. Barnes had crossed a line, and everyone knew it. The only question now was how far the system would go to protect him. "You think this is really over?" Monica asked quietly, breaking the silence. Jordan glanced at her, then shook his head. "No, Barnes won't stop until he either gets what he wants or is forced to back down permanently. Guys like him, they thrive on control. The moment they lose it, they start looking for ways to get it back." Monica sighed, wiping her hands on a towel as she surveyed the emptying plaza. Despite the tension, despite everything that had happened, they had still managed to finish the event. Kids had gotten their haircuts, parents had shown up to support them, and the community had stood together in the face of intimidation. That was something, at least a small victory in what felt like an endless war. "We can't let him win," she said firmly, more to herself than to Jordan. "This isn't just about today. If we let him get away with this, what's to stop him from doing it again to someone else, somewhere else?" Jordan smiled faintly. "That's why we don't stop. We document everything, file a formal complaint, and follow up with internal affairs. Barnes thinks he can intimidate us into silence, but he doesn't realize who he's dealing with." Monica couldn't help but laugh softly. "You really love the fight, don't you?" "It's not about loving it," Jordan said, his expression turning serious. "It's about necessity. If we don't fight back, they'll keep doing this. They'll keep thinking they can get away with it. Someone has to stand up to them." Monica nodded, her resolve hardening. She knew he was right. This wasn't just about her, or even about the event. They were part of something bigger, a larger struggle for dignity and respect in a world that too often tried to strip it away from people like them. Just then, Monica's phone buzzed. She pulled it out and saw a message from one of the parents who had attended the event. "Thank you for standing up today. It means a lot to all of us." Monica smiled, feeling a renewed sense of purpose. She hadn't done this alone. Her community had been with her every step of the way. And together, they had sent a message they wouldn't be silenced, no matter how hard Barnes or anyone else tried. Over the next few days, things moved quickly. Jordan filed an official complaint against Barnes, detailing the officer's actions and citing multiple witnesses who had been present. Several members of the community came forward to offer their support, providing statements and video evidence that further corroborated Monica and Jordan's account of the events. The complaint was forwarded to internal affairs, and soon after, word spread that Barnes had been placed on temporary suspension pending an investigation. But Jordan knew better than to trust the system to handle things fairly. Temporary suspension was a good start, but it wasn't enough. Barnes had a history of questionable behavior, and unless there was significant public pressure, the department might quietly reinstate him after a few weeks, hoping the whole thing would blow over. That was why Jordan didn't stop at filing the complaint. He reached out to local media outlets, community leaders, and advocacy groups, ensuring that the story didn't get buried. Within days, news of the incident had spread beyond their neighborhood. Articles were published detailing the confrontation, highlighting the bravery of Monica and the resilience of the community in standing up to police intimidation. The story struck a chord with many, especially in a city that had seen its fair share of similar incidents in the past. Public support began to grow, and soon, calls for a full investigation into Barnes's conduct grew louder. Meanwhile, Monica continued to focus on her work. She refused to let the incident define her or distract her from what mattered most: her community. She spent her days at the barbershop, providing a safe space for people to gather, talk, and be themselves. But even as she worked, She kept a close eye on the developments surrounding Barnes's case. She knew that staying silent wasn't an option, not now, not ever. One afternoon, about a week after the incident, Monica received a call from Councilman Davis. His voice was warm, but there was a note of urgency in his tone. "Monica, I wanted to give you a heads up," Davis said. "There's going to be a public hearing about Barnes's actions. The department is under a lot of pressure to address this properly, and they've invited community members to speak." Monica's heart skipped a beat. A public hearing was a significant step. It meant that the department couldn't sweep the incident under the rug. It also meant that she would have an opportunity to speak directly to those in power, to demand accountability not just for herself, but for everyone who had ever faced similar treatment. "I'll be there," she said without hesitation. The day of the hearing arrived quickly. The room was packed with reporters, community members, and officials. Monica sat near the front, flanked by Jordan and several other supporters. Barnes was present as well, sitting stiffly with his lawyer by his side. He looked far less confident than he had during their initial confrontation, but Monica knew better than to underestimate him. When it was her turn to speak, Monica stood and walked to the podium. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before beginning.
"My name is Monica Adams," she began, her voice clear and strong. "I'm a business owner, a community organizer, and someone who has spent my entire life working to uplift those around me. Last week, during what should have been a peaceful event for children, I was harassed, intimidated, and nearly arrested by Officer Barnes for doing nothing more than standing up for my rights." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "This isn't just about one officer's actions. It's about a system that allows officers like Barnes to believe they can act without consequence. It's about a culture that too often views people like me, Black, confident, unapologetic, as threats simply for existing." As she spoke, the room grew silent. Every eye was on her, every ear hanging on her words. Monica felt a surge of emotion, but she didn't let it overwhelm her. She remained composed, determined to finish what she had started. "I'm not here to ask for special treatment," she said. "I'm here to demand what should be a given respect, accountability, and the right to live and work without fear of harassment. We can't change what happened last week, but we can change what happens moving forward. We can ensure that officers like Barnes are held accountable, and we can send a message that this kind of behavior will not be tolerated." When she finished, the room erupted in applause. Monica returned to her seat, feeling a weight lift off her shoulders. She had spoken her truth, and now it was up to those in power to decide what came next. In the days that followed, the department announced that Barnes had been officially suspended without pay, pending further disciplinary action. It wasn't a perfect outcome, but it was a step in the right direction, a small victory in a much larger battle. Monica knew that the fight wasn't over. There would always be more to do, more battles to fight, more voices to lift. But for now, she allowed herself a moment of peace, knowing that she had done her part, that she had stood up when it mattered most. And she would continue to stand no matter what came next.